It was November 2020 in a small town in Chile, and a 12-year-old girl named Melissa Chavez was sleeping peacefully. Melissa, known for her bright smile and strong spirit, had faced a lot of tough times in her life. That night, she finally fell asleep easily, feeling safe and comfortable in her bed. What she didn't know was that this night was different. It was quiet and calm, but something was not right. This would be her last night, and the quiet around her was hiding the sad truth that her days of playing and laughing were about to end. Melissa Chavez was born in 2008 in the city of Coquimbo, Chile. She was the youngest child of Mirta Ardil and Denny Chavez, who already had 3 children. Although Mirta and Denny were really nice people, the couple decided to separate shortly after Melissa's birth after 8 years together. However, Melissa's paternal family continued to stay in touch with her. Her aunt, Gina Chavez, had a special affection for her and was always concerned for her well-being. To support her household as a single mother, Mirta worked various jobs, including in a bar. It was there she became very close friends with Maria Teresa Caballero, a co-worker. Almost every night after closing the bar, Maria would head to another nearby bar to work extra hours and earn more money. Since Mirta often accompanied her wherever she went, she eventually found employment at that place as well. One night, while Mirta was working at the bar, a regular customer approached her. His name was Luis. Although details about his life are scarce, it is known he was born in 1981, worked in a mine in Antofagasta, and lived with his then-partner. This first encounter led to a romance that neither Luis's ongoing relationship nor their age difference, with Mirta being 8 years his senior, could prevent. Eventually, Luis left his partner and moved in with Mirta. By the year 2010, when Melissa was just 2 years old. By this time, Melissa's reserved nature was already evident, a trait that did not change much as she grew older. When she started school, she was kind but clearly found it hard to socialize and had few friends. Her shyness extended towards Luis, whom she saw as a stranger. However, in 2012, when her mother and he welcomed their first child together, the new sibling helped Melissa to start accepting Luis into her life. From that point forward, he also took on a role in her upbringing, offering her affection and care as if she were his own daughter. In turn, she began to refer to him as her father. This dynamic continued for a while, allowing Melissa to experience something she had almost never had, a sense of a home without fractures. But in 2014, Luis's behavior towards her changed. Everything occurred one afternoon when he was looking after her while Mirta was at work. Just then, without warning, what had always been merely affectionate treatment turned into inappropriate touching. Melissa first confided in one of her older sisters and only afterward alerted her mother. Around the same time, the girl was seen by her school's psychologist, to whom she also revealed what had happened. Faced with the alarming disclosure and the need to act to protect the girl, the news was communicated to the school's principal. She reached out to Mirta, and knowing how serious the situation was, the psychologist and they went to talk to the authorities. A complaint was filed through the psychologist and the prosecutor's office. The prosecutor's office immediately opened a case, and as a result, the courts decided to revoke the mother's custody of her daughter. Initially, it was thought that temporary custody would be given to the biological father. However, at that time, his situation was far from ideal. On the contrary, he was suffering from deep depression and struggling with alcoholism. As such, Melissa was placed in the care of her Aunt Gina. As for Mirta, in October 2014, the same court referred her to a family court program. The goal was to subject her to psychological and psychiatric assessments. Last but not least, to regain custody of her daughter, she was required to separate from Luis. During the process, she assured the authorities that she had indeed left him. However, the reality was that she was still in contact with him secretly. After 17 months, in March 2016, following supposed new evaluations that concluded Mirta was capable of resuming personal care of her daughter, the Child Protection Agency of Coquimbo returned the custody to her. Once Melissa was back home with her, the woman also took Luis back. Not content with having the girl and the aggressor live under the same roof, Mirta went to the authorities to retract the complaints against him. Since then, the agencies closed the investigation and did not follow up on the case. Several years passed with no records of any irregular events. It's unknown whether they didn't occur or were hidden. Thus, when September 2020 arrived, Mirta and Luis moved with Melissa and her younger brother to a 2-story house. The idea was to rebuild their lives in a calmer environment. Melissa, who was 12 years old at the time, had started secondary school and was in the 7th grade. As her mother had noticed, she was becoming a more independent young lady, which was evident, for example, in her long stays alone in her room, almost always listening to music. Sleeping in was another thing she enjoyed. And while she occasionally complained that her mother was too strict and demanding, overall, Melissa seemed content in the new neighborhood. But just then, Luis sought to resume the inappropriate behavior towards her, which had been suspended after the whole ordeal caused by the initial complaint. This time, fully aware of what was happening, Mirta chose to pretend nothing was happening. She didn't even make a complaint to protect her daughter. Instead, she often felt really jealous because Luis paid more attention to Melissa. The morning of November 26, 2020 proceeded with complete normality as everyone prepared to leave the house. But before that, Luis entered the teenager's room and, unlike previous instances, completed the act in its entirety. After the abuse, he left Melissa lying on her bed, devoid of any desire to move, deeply sad and ashamed. Around 10:30 that morning, Luis and his son left the house and took a taxi they had ordered in advance through an app. The sequence was recorded by the area's security cameras. While they were going to a vaccination day at the Sun School in the city center, Mirta was losing the battle against her inner demons. Alone with her daughter at home, the woman took a knife from the kitchen and went upstairs to Melissa's bedroom. At that time, the girl had succumbed to sleep amidst tears and despair. Once in front of her, her mother attacked her, causing multiple injuries that left her agonizing. Then, Mirta sent text messages to her dentist to arrange an appointment. Afterward, she returned to Melissa's room and set fire to the lower part of the bed, where the young girl had already lost all signs of life. It was just after 11 a.m. when closed-circuit cameras recorded her leaving the home. After stopping at a store to withdraw money, Mirta took a taxi she had ordered and went to her dental appointment. Once again, her movements were captured by cameras. Barely 7 minutes after her departure, neighbors noticed smoke coming from the house and contacted emergency services. Meanwhile, Luis and his son, on their way back, saw the fire truck speeding past them. As they approached their home, Luis could see the firefighters struggling to control the flames engulfing his house. Shocked and incredulous, he called Mirta. She confirmed that she had left Melissa sleeping. Upon receiving this information, his distress was uncontrollable, so much so that he even tried to enter, but the authorities prevented him. Meanwhile, neighbors tried to offer support and calm him down. Once the team managed to partially control the fire, they identified that it had originated in one of the bedrooms. Upon entering, they found Melissa's lifeless body, which had not been completely consumed by the fire. Initially, rescuers suggested that smoke inhalation might have been the cause of her death. As for Mirta, she returned home, ready to pretend. Already notified of the tragedy, both she and Luis appeared devastated in front of the neighbors and the television cameras present. Unaware of the truth, Luis demanded justice, stating, "The person responsible, they're going to have to pay. They will have to pay for everything they did." Once Melissa's remains were transferred to the morgue, the investigation at the scene continued, and investigators collected some kitchen utensils and other items from the house for further analysis. Early findings led to the initial hypothesis of death by smoke inhalation being dismissed, and the possibility of third-party involvement began to gain traction. In the preliminary autopsy report, forensic experts noted that the body showed signs of blunt force trauma and puncture wounds. While the prosecutor requested to wait for the final results, the information somehow leaked, and soon, neighbors took to the streets demanding justice for Melissa and expressing their fear of a criminal loose in the area. After the forensic analyses were completed, and while waiting for the detailed and definitive report, Melissa's body was released to her family for the wake and subsequent burial. At the funeral, Mirta urged anyone with relevant information to cooperate in the search for the truth and clarification of the case. Visibly affected, Luis did the same. However, suspicions were directed at the victim's mother, especially considering she had been the last to leave the house on that fateful day. Others claimed to have seen an older man leaving just before the smoke was noticed. This last theory was convenient for Mirta, who clung to it. However, upon reviewing the security cameras around the house, investigators found no evidence of the alleged presence of this individual. Therefore, they decided to pause this line of inquiry while continuing to search for new clues. Meanwhile, since their involvement could not be entirely ruled out, Luis and Mirta were summoned as suspects. On that occasion, both repeated their version of events. Additionally, their cell phones were made available to the authorities. Shortly after, the autopsy results confirmed the severity of the attack Melissa suffered, which, according to forensic doctors, would not have been fatal had she received timely medical help. The detectives in charge of the case revealed chilling details, confirming she suffered cranioencephalic trauma and had 11 sharp force injuries. The worst part was that they estimated she had agonized for approximately an hour. Recent sexual abuse was also indicated by injuries, but no genetic material could be retrieved. From that moment, Luis became a focus for the prosecutor, who could not ignore the 2014 precedent. Meanwhile, chemical tests performed on the seized utensils found traces of the victim's and her mother's DNA, particularly on the knife used in the attack. The prosecutor's office revealed crucial details about this evidence. The knife used in the attack had a distinctive tip damage, matching the injuries and fractures on the teenager's skull. Moreover, it wasn't just that the mother's and daughter's DNA was found, but where it was located. According to the Legal Medical Service, Melissa's genetic material was on the blade, and a significant genetic fingerprint of Mirta was on the handle. Chemical tests also showed that after being used as a weapon, it was washed to remove blood traces. With all this evidence supporting a case beyond reasonable doubt, on February 2, 2021, Mirta was arrested as the alleged perpetrator of the crime. Later, the police provided details including their knowledge of the events. At the formalization hearing, the public prosecutor charged Mirta with the crime of homicide. After presenting a video that evidenced the chronology of the event, the prosecutor pointed out the absence of eyewitnesses, the mother's attempt to erase all evidence, and the short span between her departure and the smoke sighting. In summary, for the public prosecutor, It was a passionate and ferocious crime. Although the defense insisted on her innocence, the prosecutor dismissed the idea outright. During the investigation, Myrta was held in preventive detention for 6 months. However, the public prosecutor's office still needed to investigate the nature of the relationship between Luis and the minor. Aware of his precarious situation, Luis fled. Despite authorities' efforts to locate him, neither relatives nor friends had any information about his whereabouts. In parallel, a multitude of neighbors and family members expressed their condemnation of Myrta, demanding justice for Melissa, while the house became a symbol of commemoration and protest. Myrta's defense attorney challenged the decision to keep her detained during the investigation period, but on February 10th, the Court of Appeals confirmed the preventive detention measure against Myrta. One of the most affected was obviously Gina Melissa's paternal aunt. Amid her grief, she criticized the failures of a system that, in her opinion, did not adequately follow up with the family or verify that the mother was qualified to regain custody. She was particularly outraged that the authorities had not ensured Myrta and Luis's separation. Eventually, the various efforts to locate Luis yielded results on Wednesday, November 17, 2021, when he was discovered in the upper area of Coquimbo. He was handed over to justice, facing charges for repeated abuses of a minor. The next day, the defendant was made available to the Court of Guarantees. During the hearing, the prosecution presented further details of the crimes he had committed against Melissa. After hearing the arguments of the prosecution, ordered preventive detention for Luis and his admission to jail, arguing that releasing him posed a danger to society. Meanwhile, on November 29th, the prosecution formally charged Myrta and added a new charge for being an accomplice to the sexual crimes committed by her partner against her daughter. Nearly a year later, on September 23, 2022, the investigation's closing hearing took place. That day, the arguments of the parties to justify continuing the trial highlighted the testimonies of fellow inmates from the penitentiary where Myrta was held in preventive detention. They pointed out that Myrta dedicated all her time to taking care of her appearance and never showed remorse or sadness for how she had acted against her own daughter. They also presented a psychological profile of the accused, indicating to the court that she did not understand empathy but was very familiar with manipulation, as she had provided details and information from the beginning to distort her actions and divert suspicions that arose around her. They stated that Myrta was a person with a preserved reality judgment, aware of the illegality of her acts and the consequences of her actions. This made her culpable as she presented a personality disorder but no loss of contact with reality. Awaiting trial, the regional prosecutor announced he would request life imprisonment for Myrta. For Luis, he would seek a sentence of more than 20 years in prison. On January 21, 2023, just before the trial began, Myrta was urgently transferred from jail to the hospital due to complications from kidney stones. Her hospitalization became public through a photo leaked on social media, prompting criticism from the defense team for the lack of privacy for their client. 3 days after a successful operation, she was discharged and returned to prison. Given the extreme gravity of the events and the fact that they involved a minor, the Child Rights Defense Office requested that the hearings be conducted without media presence. During the last preparatory hearing for the trial, the defense attorney focused on the absence of genetic material to dismiss the accusations against Luis. Ultimately, considering the evidence presented by the public prosecutor's office insufficient, the court dismissed the charges, and instead of preventive detention, Luis was placed under house arrest with a prohibition on leaving the country. Despite this decision, he still had to face a trial. Mirta was not as fortunate. Despite her lawyer's efforts, the highest judicial authority determined she should remain in preventive detention. The trial for Melissa's case took place on April 23, 2023. Presenting a detailed chronology of the events leading to the tragic outcome, the prosecutor asserted that all evidence pointed unequivocally to Mirta, a woman whose jealousy led her to see a rival in her own daughter. To support her case, security camera footage was exhibited in court. The defense criticized what they considered a lack of thoroughness in the investigation, arguing that other leads that could have led to the real culprit and not Mirta were not sufficiently explored. The defense attorneys requested that the court consider their client's substantial cooperation since the beginning of the investigation, initially as witnesses and later as defendants. They proposed a sentence of 10 years for homicide and 5 for arson for Mirta, and a 3-year and 1-day prison sentence for Luis. However, both the public prosecutor and the case advocates opposed all the requests. On May 17, 2023, in a unanimous decision, the court found Luis and Mirta guilty of the charged crimes. Following the verdict, the prosecutors thanked the support of civil society and the entities involved in the investigation, including the experts from the forensic laboratory. On May 27, 2023, the court sentenced Mirta to 33 years in prison, 18 for homicide, and 15 for being the author of a consummated arson. Luis Santander was sentenced to 10 years and 1 day for repeated sexual abuse of Melissa Chavez and was prohibited from engaging in activities involving minors. The case deeply shocked Chilean society, and though the sentences could not reverse the irreparable loss of Melissa and the life she could have had, they brought some consolation to the community with the effective action of the judiciary. Dear viewers, this concludes today's story. Remember to subscribe and leave a like to let me know you appreciate my work. Good night. By mid-2009, after 7 years of marriage, Lucy Landry began an affair with Gareth Jenkins, an old school friend she reconnected with on Facebook. She was tired of the 24-year age difference with her husband and his controlling nature, which had left her increasingly lonely and disillusioned. She asked her husband for a divorce and demanded that he, who was suffering from prostate cancer, pay £6,000 for a new flat for her and Mr. Jenkins to move into. The pair started to row constantly over money. On February 1st, in the presence of a neighbor, Lucy taunted her husband about naked photographs he had taken of himself 3 months previously, which she had found on his computer, calling him a pervert and taunting him that he should be on the sex offenders register. That night, they argued violently, following each other around the house, shouting and taunting each other over money, possessions, and Mr. Jenkins. The fight ended in a way that no one expected. Lucy Davies was born in 1971 in the county of Rhondda, England. She was the daughter of Roger and Andrea Davies, who were also the proud parents of another girl named Anna. The family was settled in a small community mainly formed by socially purposed housing. There, against the backdrop of beautiful mountain scenery, Lucy had a particularly happy childhood. Since she and her little sister had similar tastes, they were always very close. Her parents always highlighted Lucy's infectious joy as a standout quality. During her time in primary school, Lucy was known for her outgoing and likable temperament, which immediately endeared her to teachers and classmates alike. In addition to her charming personality, she was also recognized for her undeniable beauty, making her one of the most popular and admired girls at school. Regarding interests outside of academics, both she and Anna loved ponies. Knowing this, their father pleasantly surprised them by enrolling both in the local riding club. This sporting activity taught them discipline and also showcased their talent. Consequently, they earned the right to participate and represent the club in countless events and competitions. Thus, by the start of secondary school, Lucy shone as an exceptional rider. However, her energy and passion were not limited to the tracks, as the versatile young lady began to take flute and piano lessons, dedicating long hours to practice to master both instruments. Her efforts soon paid off, and by the following year, Lucy had a very comprehensive and detailed mastery of the wide field of classical music. Thanks to this, she was accepted into a youth orchestra and also joined her school's choir group. As often happens in this stage of adolescence, a healthy romantic interest appeared in her life, and Lucy became very close to Gareth Jenkins. However, she preferred to keep it a secret. In 1989, after finishing secondary school, Lucy was determined to pursue a career in the musical world. With that goal in mind, she enrolled to undertake a bachelor's degree at the University of Warwick. There, she began her new and promising life, always with the aspiration of becoming a teacher and dedicating herself to musical education. But things did not go as she had expected. While her passion remained, she did not enjoy the direction of the degree program. Consequently, she decided to switch her original plan and opted to study urban planning. It was around this time that she met Graham McAllister. They both discovered quite soon that their outlook on life was very similar. Aside from their love for art and shared interests, a crucial detail in their bond was the extravagant sense of humor that complemented each other. Their relationship flowed naturally, and as they made plans for the future, Lucy decided to introduce him to her parents. For Roger and Andrea, the meeting was wonderful, as they were certain that Graham was the right one for their daughter. So much so that they decided to buy Lucy a house in the city of Coventry, northwest of London. This gesture, in addition to ensuring her a life free from the upheavals of rent and moving, carried their wish for her to start a family. Shortly after moving in, Lucy invited her boyfriend to share the new home. As they continued with their studies in 1995, the young couple welcomed their first child, whom they named James. Lucy decided it was best to take a break from university to care for him. Meanwhile, Graham continued with his university commitments and, to support the household expenses, got a job working the night shift at the city's postal sorting office. Over the months, this dynamic began to affect Lucy, because alone at home, dedicated exclusively to the child, and with many hours away from her partner, a feeling of boredom took hold of her. Then, she found no better solution than to explore internet chat rooms for distraction. In this universe, she sought to meet new people. One night, while Lucy was immersed in lively conversations in various chat rooms, she came into contact with Harold Landry. At 53 years old and of American origin, Harold came from a financially struggling family in Louisiana. However, he understood early on that, being just one among a dozen siblings, he would have to achieve everything through his own effort and will. Thus, from a young age, he dedicated himself to hard work to escape poverty. His opportunity arrived when he realized that in the oil business, the key was not in owning a well, but in providing the essential infrastructure for the owners of such fields. Consequently, he founded his own company, focused exclusively on the design and manufacture of hydraulic equipment for major oil companies in the southern United States. As he had anticipated, the business allowed him to amass a great fortune, eventually reaching billionaire status. By that time, he divided his time between his eccentric hobbies and a property on the island of Cozumel in Mexico. On a personal level, he had been married and divorced twice. From these unions, he had children whose exact number and identities are not publicly known. What was known, however, was that Harold made sure they lacked nothing. A particularly relevant event occurred in 1992 when, being single again, he met a married woman 20 years his junior. However, neither her family nor her husband were obstacles for Harold, who directed all his seductive strategy towards her and won her over. On February 6, 1994, Harold picked her up to take her for a ride in New Orleans. For this occasion, they hired a babysitter. After concluding the evening, Harold accompanied his lover back to her home and offered to take the babysitter back to hers. No one seemed concerned about the fact that the husband would find out about the betrayal and could act as a wounded man. In fact, that's exactly what happened. Outside the residence, the betrayed husband was monitoring every move of his wife. Once the third party said goodbye, he followed him in his car. A few minutes later, Harold finally noticed the vehicle tailing him. Then, almost as an instinctive gesture, he opened the glove compartment and pulled out the firearm he usually kept. When both stopped at a red light, things spiraled out of control, as the babysitter later narrated. Harold then brandished a revolver at the betrayed husband and fired. The bullet severed an artery in his neck and damaged a nerve leading to a vocal cord. The husband, called Chris Price, collapsed on the pavement with a wound on his neck, but fortunately, there was a hospital right in front of them, which allowed him to receive immediate aid, and the doctors were able to save his life. As for Harold, he was arrested and charged with attempted murder. The trial against him took place in 1997. In his opening statement, the defense attorney told the jury that Chris had only been the victim of a tragic and sordid affair. Regarding his client, he mentioned that he acted out of fear and in self-defense. The defense's clever strategy led the jury, consisting of 4 men and 8 women, to find Harold guilty of the lesser charge of aggravated assault. As a result, he was sentenced to 5 years behind bars. After appealing, Harold obtained probation. In exchange, he had to pay a fine of $500 and fulfill community service obligations. Although he sought to be completely exonerated, he thanked Pat for his hard work. Since then, they became great friends. Shortly after, Harold and Chris agreed on an undisclosed settlement amount. By the time Harold began talking with Lucy, he was residing in Covington and was still wealthy enough not to have to work. He was also honest about his occupations and everything related to his past life, including love affairs and legal details. But all these elements only served to increase Lucy's attraction to him. What followed was an engaging online romance, with Harold promising her a more than tempting lifestyle. His persistence and persuasive power bore fruit when Lucy finally asked Graham to end their relationship. Thus, he had the path clear, without a rival that could cause him trouble, as had happened with Chris. With the wind in his favor in the early 2000s, Harold traveled to England to meet her, and she took the opportunity to introduce him to her parents as her boyfriend. Although Roger and Andrea were surprised by the significant age difference, they respected their daughter's decisions and did not object to the relationship. Feeling fulfilled and fortunate to share his life with her, Harold spared no effort to surprise her, whether with luxurious gifts or anything else Lucy desired. In fact, by then, he was so in love that he was already planning to propose marriage. However, he didn't want it to be just any proposal. He wished to do it in an ideal setting. To achieve this goal, he took her, along with her son James, and included Graham in the group on a trip. The chosen destination was Mexico, which for Harold was by then his favorite place in the world. Additionally, his longtime friend Pat, who had been his attorney in the past trial, also had an apartment close to his residence, which added to the feeling of comfort. Initially, Harold bought a diamond ring and shared the news with enthusiasm with Pat. Nonetheless, his friend harbored certain suspicions about his future fiancée. Moreover, over the days, Pat found it strange that Lucy had dedicated a good part of her time in the company of Graham. He seemed to be completely blind to it, and ultimately, he proceeded with his plan to propose. Lucy happily accepted the proposal, and in mid-2003, the couple celebrated their union. Shortly afterward, Harold surprised her by acquiring a $1 million property in an exclusive neighborhood in Worcestershire. In this rural setting, the marriage had a prosperous and peaceful start, further favored by the presence of excellent neighbors like Rachel Clark and Stephen Kennedy, with whom Harold and Lucy formed a lovely friendship. Soon, the newlyweds had their first daughter, whom they named Harriet. The event filled both Lucy and Harold with joy, and from then on, he dedicated himself to the little girl with undiminished energy and commitment. Equally important and affectionate was the relationship he maintained with James, whom he treated as if he were his own son. But relentless time began to erode their initial bliss. Gradually, the demands made towards Lucy increased, and her moodiness became directly proportional to her husband's demands. As he saw it, his wife was to constantly adjust to his preferences and adopt a submissive role to his requests. She, on the other hand, had different expectations, so tensions quickly became apparent. As a conclusion, Lucy was direct and unafraid to express her thoughts, and in this dynamic, her husband was not willing to yield. With both having volatile personalities, their arguments often culminated in explosive breakups, followed by reconciliation once the storm had passed. Thus, moments that had once been pleasurable, like the children's vacations, became increasingly marred by fights. Meanwhile, James witnessed the disintegration of his mother and stepfather's relationship. To their neighbors' dismay, the disputes that stretched on for hours became a sort of regular soundtrack. By that time, Rachel and Stephen were aware that the couple had a tendency to abuse alcohol, knowing well that this was the fuel that ignited their shouting and complaints. When Lucy and Harold unleashed all their anger, leading to prolonged periods of not speaking to each other, their neighbors felt peace return. In mid-2009, thanks to social media, Lucy reconnected with Gareth. Having had no contact since their platonic love in secondary school, they caught up and chatted for hours, with necessary interruptions due to both of their commitments. After Harold went to sleep, his wife stayed in front of the screen. Soon, it became evident to him that, feeling unhappy, his wife had resorted to the same escape route through which she had found him, and he had no doubt she was looking for a replacement. However, far from confronting her, he considered giving her some space and traveled to Mexico, where he stayed for a while. Meanwhile, Lucy took the opportunity to invite Gareth to stay with her. In the autumn of 2009, her husband returned to England, thinking this time would resolve their marriage. But as soon as he stepped into the house, Lucy asked him for a divorce. Initially, he felt devastated. Then, after a few weeks, Harold began a relationship. He met this new woman online. She lived in the vicinity and went by the name of Rachel. Parallel to each of their new romances, the divorce negotiations were underway, and as often happens, new conflicts emerged. Especially concerning the house, Lucy expected to keep it to ensure a roof over her children's heads. For Harold, on the other hand, this matter was non-negotiable. His solution was to offer her money to buy herself a more modest apartment on her own. At the same time, he completely excluded her from his will. Upon learning of the decisions of her still husband, Lucy flew into a rage. Her feelings of hatred towards him made her share everything about Harold's past with her son James, not leaving anything out. Amidst the complicated process and considering the evident tension she was living in, Gareth invited her to spend a few days with him in Wales. Upon her return to familiar surroundings, Lucy no longer wished to disguise or hide her lengthy phone conversations with her new love. Meanwhile, both she and Harold were immersed in excessive alcohol consumption. The arguments escalated to unexpected heights, leaving the children at the mercy of a violent and unbearable atmosphere. On the afternoon of Monday, February 1st, 2010, Harold drank several glasses of wine. At one point, he received a package intended for Stephen. Around 9 o'clock at night, when Stephen returned from work, he found a postal notification indicating that his parcel had been delivered to his neighbor. The Landry's lights were on, so he went there. Harold invited him in and served him a glass of wine. After greeting Lucy and exchanging a few words, Stephen noticed how drunk his host was. He took his package, excused himself, and left. Subsequently, the couple engaged in a nonsensical argument, specifically over a furniture purchase she was planning for their move. James acted as the years of fights had taught him. This time, the disagreement escalated to a physical altercation. In the scuffle, Harold grabbed a kitchen utensil with which he struck Lucy on the cheek. Unable to continue avoiding the facts, James appeared at the scene of the dispute and found his mother injured. He immediately called the police and then focused on securing his younger sister's safety. Not long after, Lucy and her children left the house seeking help. The first place she thought to go was to Stephen's house. However, just as she headed in that direction, Harold caught up to her and, with a knife, caused her multiple injuries. Then he left her under a bush in the garden and walked away. Alerted by the screams, Stephen went outside. It only took him a few steps to discover his neighbor. Although he initially thought she was unconscious, he quickly understood the severity of the situation. At that moment, responding to the emergency call, the police arrived at the scene. They called the paramedics and searched the vicinity for the perpetrator. However, they only found the children, hidden and terrified in the backyard amidst the darkness. Once on site, the paramedics acted as quickly as possible, and Lucy was transported to the hospital. Very shortly after, her heart stopped. Meanwhile, Harold went to Rachel's house and confessed that something terrible had happened, but without giving further details. He then gave her 3 bank drafts totaling $40,000, a sum of cash, the keys to his car, and several signed blank checks. Then he set off back home. By that time, several police patrols were trying to locate him. Eventually, they found him walking along the road and proceeded to arrest him. Roger and Andrea were overwhelmed with despair upon hearing the tragic news. In a statement shared by the police, they asked for respect during their time of unimaginable sorrow from losing their daughter. For now, they had nothing more to say to the media. From then on, all their attention was focused on looking after their grandchildren. The forensic examination confirmed that Lucy had died as a result of multiple stab wounds to the chest. With this evidence and having James as a first-hand witness, on February 5, 2010, Harold appeared before the court and was charged with murder. The trial took place in early February 2011. It was presided over by Judge David Foskett. On this occasion, Pat was not the defender of his friend. That task fell to attorney Andy Childs. Despite the evident difficulty of his task, the defense attorney argued that his client had been provoked by the fury of his wife, who left him no alternative but to act as he did. During his initial statements from the stand, Harold, amid sobs, stated that he loved Lucy and regretted his actions. He then adhered to the strategy laid out by his lawyer, admitting to involuntary manslaughter because, in his words, Lucy had pushed him to the limit. To highlight the violence of the case, the prosecution presented a very detailed animation of the multiple injuries suffered by the victim. This presentation was shocking to those present in the courtroom. Finally, on February 24, 2011, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Harold Landry guilty of the murder of his wife, Lucy Landry, who was 38 years old at the time of her death, while Harold was 64. The following day was for the judge to impose the sentence. He had harsh words for Harold, whose attack he described as indescribable and unforgivable. He also dismissed Harold's claims of possible provocation by Lucy, considering them a vain attempt by the defendant to save himself. Consequently, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 16 years before being eligible for parole. By that time, however, he would be over 80 years old. Lucy's loved ones thanked not only for the resolution, but also for the judge's remarks, which they felt almost perfectly expressed what they themselves felt. They noted that the sentence somehow helped alleviate the pain of their loss, although they also admitted that no number of years in prison for Harold would bring back Lucy's life, so they would have to work on accepting this painful reality. For his part, Harold insisted on proclaiming his innocence, as he was heard saying he hoped to be able to appeal the sentence in the future. And that's the case for today. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. See you soon. On November 15, 2013, Chris called 911. He said he had arrived home and found his parents unresponsive in their truck. Chris said that Roger was coughing and that Melissa's head was bobbing up and down. He said they were alive but barely moving. The dispatcher asked Chris to put them on their backs to try to administer CPR. Roger and Melissa had both been shot in the right side of their heads. Melissa Blumel died the next day, and Roger Blumel died about 5 weeks later. Roger Blumel was born on January 17, 1965, into a household bustling with many members, including his parents and 7 children, 6 boys and a girl. Roger's family was not only large but also very united, raised with a strong sense of values and community life. Even while still in high school, Roger proved to be a hard-working young man with goals for the future. He began driving his father's truck and, after graduating from the local high school, worked in concrete transportation. Later, he discovered that his true calling was in sales, a field in which he eventually found success. According to his friends, he was one of those people capable of selling ice to Eskimos. This skill was also accompanied by a generous, cheerful, and extroverted personality. He always seemed happy, and nothing pleased him more than making everyone around him have a big smile on their faces. Roger had a good life and an excellent relationship with his family. The only thing missing was a partner, and one day he achieved that too. The details are not specified, but a close friend later recounted that at the end of the evening, when he met a young woman who captivated him, Roger declared with absolute resolution that she was the woman he was going to marry. The girl in question was named Melissa. She was born in Wichita on January 1, 1960. Her childhood, too, was spent in a loving family comprised of 3 girls and 3 boys, though a younger sister died before reaching her first birthday. Melissa was a sweet, hard-working girl, always ready to help not just her family but everyone around her. She began working as a cashier at a bank where she made a successful career. In the following years, her seriousness, commitment, and sense of collaboration earned her several promotions that led her to become the vice president of the bank. That first meeting marked the beginning of the union of two soulmates who married in 1991. Life for the Blumels seemed perfect as Melissa climbed the ranks within the bank, and Roger's charm led him to establish his own business. Roger loved to share time with friends and bring joy to everyone around him. In Melissa, he found the perfect companion. Moreover, both had a strong social consciousness that led them to collaborate and participate in any charitable, sports, or collective activity that took place in their community. However, as we've seen in almost all stories, a perfect life does not exist, and for the Blumels, the only thing missing was a child to bring laughter and joy to their loving home. Unfortunately, this desire remained elusive for the couple, and after years of unsuccessfully trying to conceive, Roger and Melissa began to consider the idea of adopting a child. With this intention, they contacted a local social worker. Their wishes were heard, and doubly so, as a woman named Keisha Schaberg had put up her two sons for adoption. Anthony, 7 years old, whom everyone called Tony, and Christopher, 4 years old, known as Chris. Keisha's idea was to place them in an open adoption so she could maintain contact with her sons and the family raising them. However, the Blumels did not consider this the best option, as they wanted to raise the children as their own and completely remove them from what had been a tough start in life. In the end, Roger and Melissa's approach prevailed, and from that moment, Tony and Chris formally became part of the Blumel family, starting to enjoy a life they never knew existed. In fact, it was later known that Tony was amazed he was allowed to have dinner every day. The children quickly adapted and began to enjoy their new life. They attended elementary school and successfully completed that stage as good students. In high school, they were also successful, had no problems with their peers, were fully integrated and made a wide group of friends, and excelled in sports, particularly in wrestling and football. Tony made rapid progress in wrestling, securing second place in a competition in his division. At that time, everything seemed to promise a bright future for the boys and a happy life for the whole family. But the Blumels' world began to turn upside down when Tony reached his senior year of high school. The young man began to change what had until then been exemplary behavior. He turned into someone who was constantly in conflict with his parents, accusing them of always favoring his younger brother Chris. From then on, he engaged in alcohol consumption, disregarded curfews, and even smoked marijuana. Things in the Blumel household became chaotic, and soon it seemed that the last hope for the young man to correct his path was lost. For a long time, Tony had expressed a fervent desire to join the United States Air Force after finishing high school. But this dream dissipated due to his own behavior when, in 2013, he was arrested for an unspecified act of aggression, and shortly after graduating, again for driving under the influence of alcohol. With these records, he could say goodbye to a future in military aviation. These events did not lead Tony to reflect. On the contrary, it plunged him into a downward spiral. Once he graduated from high school, his life had no direction. He did not want to continue studying, nor did he want to work. In fact, he wanted to do nothing more than sleep late and spend the rest of his day immersed in a cloud of cannabis smoke. Melissa lived in terror of the boy's outbursts of rage. And amidst all this situation, which was so difficult to bear, there was something else that the Blumels did not know. Since the spring of 2013, through social media, Keisha had been contacting her biological sons. While it seems Chris either rejected Keisha's friend request or was not very receptive to communicating with his biological mother, Tony not only accepted immediately, but was also completely excited to reconnect with his real mother. Keisha had been devastated after giving her sons to the Blumels. Although she was relieved to know that both had been welcomed into the same good family and would stay together, she could not resign herself to the lack of contact. Reconnecting with her eldest son filled Keisha with excitement, but at the same time she developed a great resentment towards the Blumels, believing that they had turned Chris against her. However, this feeling was undoubtedly overshadowed by the happiness of reconnecting with her firstborn. Additionally, the news of Tony's problems with his adoptive parents fueled Keisha's hope of reuniting with her son, and she wasted no time in offering him to come to see her. Meanwhile, at the adoptive family's home, far from improving, things were getting worse. The conflict reached a point of no return when one day, in the midst of one of his fits of rage, Tony punched a hole in a wall. This was the turning point for the Blumels. They could no longer risk their own safety and that of Chris. After several unsuccessful discussions trying to put an end to the eldest son's behaviors, Roger and Melissa came to the difficult decision to tell Tony that he had to leave the house. The young man initially wandered aimlessly but soon realized he had to do something to sustain himself, so he got some jobs at fast food restaurants and supplemented those meager earnings by selling cannabis. Although he slept like a nomad from night to night at some friends' houses, he ended up associating with a group of youths who were deeply involved in excessive drug use. And amid all these despairing events, a lifeline suddenly appeared for Tony when Keisha told him to come to California to live with her. Tony eagerly accepted the invitation, and the reunion took place in September 2013 at Keisha's house in California. The young man was accompanied by his best friend from high school, Braden, who had dropped out in his junior year to dedicate himself to drug dealing. The two young men were excited because they arrived with the hope of having Keisha's support, who was also versed in the drug trade, to start a large marijuana business in the area, and they even talked about entering the medical cannabis market. The reality was that the two young men had arrived to live in a small apartment which had only one room. It is not hard to imagine that the situation in the place began to be tense, particularly because Sean, Keisha's partner, had 2 jobs and was the only one bringing in money to cover the expenses for 5 people. Keisha only contributed a part of the social assistance she received for her daughter. Keisha, Tony, and Braden spent their days using drugs, and the woman's younger daughter was all the time under that bad influence. Logically, at one point things reached an unacceptable limit, something that happened when Sean found out that Tony and Braden were selling marijuana near her house. She let them know that what they were doing was simply unacceptable and dangerous for her as the property owner. Consequently, she told them to take their drugs elsewhere. Additionally, after this episode, Sean gave an ultimatum to the house occupants. Everyone had to get a job or leave the apartment. Far from making the group reflect, as was her intention, what it achieved was that they formed an alliance to show indignation towards her. They decided to leave the apartment and go to a nearby hotel for 2 weeks. But that was not the solution either, because without having an income, after those weeks they had no means to sustain the hotel payment. The need for money did not make them consider working decently. The first idea they had was to return to Kansas, perhaps because it was familiar territory for Tony in terms of drug dealing. After almost a day on the road, the group decided to stop in Arizona and spend the night at a hotel. It was there that Tony told his travel companions that he had come up with an idea, which was to end the lives of his adoptive parents to claim the inheritance. Once they arrived in Wichita and found accommodation at a hotel they rented for a month, they dedicated themselves to refining the details of that idea. It was a simple solution. They had to end the lives of Roger and Melissa, claim the insurance, sell the assets, and use the resources to start a new, larger-scale drug business. Tony was convinced that the original family, which he had returned to, would become rich by cultivating and selling marijuana. Tony even proposed a perfect day to carry out the crime. It would be Friday, November 15th of that year, 2013, as his brother Chris would not be at home, as he had to attend an event related to his wrestling practice. Tony had been a star in that discipline and still maintained contact with some team members, which is how he learned about his brother's commitment that night. Gradually, the plan was formed, in which Tony would communicate with Roger and Melissa and invite them somewhere with the excuse of talking about what had happened between them and try to fix things. Tony's idea was that, while there was no one at home, Braden would take Keisha to the residence so she could enter and steal some valuables. Tony also knew where his adoptive parents kept a significant amount of money for emergencies. The idea was that the act would appear to be a robbery gone wrong. But from the beginning, the final intention was clear. When Roger and Melissa returned home, Keisha would end their lives. Everyone thought it was an excellent plan, but later, Braden backed out. He did not want to participate in the act, but agreed to help by acquiring the guns they would need. As a substitute, he recommended a friend of his, also a former high school peer named Andrew, who could take on the role as the driver to take Keisha to the Blumels' residence. As promised, Braden procured 2 pistols purchased from other criminals. It should be mentioned that there was never any intention to share the money with Andrew, who was agreed to be paid $1,000 to act essentially as a driver and support for Keisha in the robbery. In the end, she would be the executor. In early November, Keisha posted on her social networks a photo of her with Tony and a caption that read, "A bond that cannot be broken." Finally, the day arrived. It was Friday, November 15th, 2013, and as Tony had predicted, his wonderful adoptive parents did not refuse to meet with him. The meeting went peacefully. While at the Blumels' house, the scene was completely different. As soon as Roger and Melissa left for the meeting, Keisha and Andrew entered the house, forced the garage door, and began to rummage through everything. They took the opportunity to take some small, valuable items and the cash the couple kept in the house for any eventuality. Once the first part of the plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew hid beside the secluded residence to wait for their victims to arrive. They soon received a call from Tony, informing them that the meeting had ended, that his adoptive parents had dropped him off at the hotel, and they were on their way home. The wait was not too long. As soon as the Blumels' vehicle stopped in front of the parking gate, the 2 attackers came out of their hiding place. Keisha immediately positioned herself on Melissa's side, while Andrew aimed at Roger to keep him still. Melissa, still surprised, recognized the mother of the children they had adopted more than 10 years ago to provide love, stability, and a better future. She only managed to say, "Oh my God, Keisha," when a precise shot to the head made her collapse in the seat. Roger, completely disconcerted, tried to assist his wife. Meanwhile, Keisha reached the man's window and pulled the trigger towards Roger's head, but the gun jammed. The woman made several attempts to shoot while he was frozen, with the slumped body of his wife next to him. Finally, the gun fired, and Roger also collapsed next to the one who had been the best partner for his life project. Once the fatal plan was carried out, Keisha and Andrew boarded the vehicle they had arrived in and quickly left. The Blumel spouses remained there until around 9:15 p.m., when Chris returned from his meeting and found the terrible scene. He immediately called 911, reporting that he had just arrived home and found his parents practically unconscious inside their van. The young man stated that Roger was coughing and that Melissa was bobbing her head up and down. Both had gunshot marks on their heads. The dispatcher instructed him to try resuscitation maneuvers while emergency services arrived a few minutes later and took over the situation. Miraculously, the Blumels were still alive, but their lives were hanging by a thread, so they were immediately transported to a hospital. While all this was happening, upon returning to the hotel where they were staying, Keisha seemed to have a panic attack and stated that all she needed was to consume some illicit substance, and she did so accompanied by the other boys. Also, at that moment, Keisha handed over the used gun and a wallet of Melissa's that she had stolen from the house to be disposed of in a nearby stream. Andrew threw the items into the pond of a nearby park. The following day, Tony began using the money stolen from his adoptive parents' home to start trafficking marijuana, earning his first $100. Unfortunately, that same day, Melissa lost her battle and passed away at the age of 53. Tony also went to the hospital to see his father, but what he did not know is that sometime before, he had been removed from both the Blumels' will and their insurance policies. Consequently, the two heinous crimes had been committed in vain. In the following days, it was also discovered that Andrew had not been paid and was even unaware that Keisha had taken cash from the Blumel family's home. Eventually, fate caught up with them. In the initial inspections of the Blumel residence, the police noticed that the garage door had been forced open, and inside the home everything was in disarray. There were items scattered everywhere. It was confirmed that money, jewelry, and other items had been stolen. The authorities wondered if the attack on the spouses had been a result of them arriving while the thieves were still in the house. However, the fatal assault had occurred before the couple entered the home, so this initial hypothesis was dismissed. In the van where Roger and Melissa were attacked, there were no significant fingerprints, although investigators did find a bullet casing. Then, the authorities turned their attention towards the victims' workplaces, thinking perhaps an upset client had sought revenge. But this theory was also discarded, so it was time to talk to people close to the couple. The first on the detectives' list was Tony, as he had been the last person seen alive with the victims. But the young man insisted he knew nothing and had not participated in the act. According to him, after finishing dinner, he had gone straight back to the hotel where he was staying with his mother. This information was confirmed by the staff at the tolls. The second on the list was Chris, who had found the bodies, but he was quickly dismissed after verifying his statement that at the time of the incident, he was at a dinner with members of the wrestling team. However, the investigators found something strange in the young man's behavior. He didn't seem overly disturbed and instead appeared to be lost in thought. When the police pursued this direction and asked him what he thought had happened to his parents, Chris immediately replied that there was only one person who came to mind. He added that the only one who might hold any grudge against their parents, and perhaps be capable of such an act, was his older brother, Tony. With this significant lead, the authorities got a lucky break in their search for the culprits. A man contacted the police to say that a young man who was a friend of Tony had approached him intending to buy a gun. The detectives focused on this individual, and upon checking his background found he had a long history related to drugs. Moreover, they discovered he had traveled to California along with Tony. It was Braden. Sooner rather than later, Braden received a message from his family informing him that the sheriff's office investigators were looking to interrogate him about what had happened to the Blumels. The morning after receiving this information, Braden went to the police station. A press report states that on his way to the police station, he stopped by a pond to throw away something, apparently the guns used in the crime, which had not been disposed of as planned. According to this account, he was already under surveillance, and when the police searched the water, they found in the bag he threw a pistol that had not been fired in the attack. Braden's interrogation lasted for 3 days. At first, the young man maintained he had nothing to do with the incident, but he couldn't withstand the pressure from the authorities and ended up confessing everything he knew, stating that the idea for the attack had been Tony's. Tony Blumel, 18 years old, and his biological mother, Keisha, 35, were arrested on November 19th at the hotel where they were staying. Additionally, Andrew, then 18 years old, was arrested. And finally, Braden, also 18, was put behind bars on November 20th of that same year, 2013. At that time, Keisha did not admit her participation in the robbery and other crimes, although the 3 young men confessed what had happened. On November 25, 2013, the accused made their first appearance before the court via video conference. On that occasion, they were all charged with the same offenses: first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated robbery, burglary, and theft. The 3 young men were set a bail of $500,000, and for Keisha, the bail was set at $1 million. On December 21st, Roger's heart stopped beating, and at 48 years old, he joined his beloved Melissa. And after Roger's death, the situation for the woman and the 3 young men worsened, as they could be charged with capital murder, which could imply a death penalty sentence. Indeed, on January 3, 2014, the 4 detainees were formally charged with a count of capital murder for being the alleged perpetrators of the death of more than 1 person in the same incident. Additionally, Keisha was charged with 2 counts of aggravated robbery, 1 count of burglary, and 1 count of theft. The preliminary hearing took place on July 17th of that same year. By that time, Braden had negotiated with the authorities, and in exchange for a benefit in his sentence, he ended up becoming the prosecution's star witness. After a year of negotiations, not only did Braden reach an agreement, but 2 other individuals involved in the crime also negotiated with the prosecution. According to the agreements reached, the accused would not dispute the charges against them and would waive their right to appeal their sentences. In exchange, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty and to drop some charges. Starting in mid-2015, in separate hearings, each confirmed their decision to plead guilty. The judge sentenced Keisha to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the capital murder charge, and additionally to 122 months in prison for 2 counts of aggravated robbery. The sentences would be served consecutively. In her opportunity to speak, she stated she deeply regretted what had happened and lamented everything the Blumel family had to go through. The rest of her statement was controversial, as she claimed she had nothing to do with the incident, having no anger towards the Blumels. On the contrary, she had the utmost respect for them, as they had given Tony and Chris a wonderful life, and she would always be grateful for that. According to official records to this day, Keisha remains detained in a high-security level correctional facility. The second to face his fate was her son, Anthony Blumel, known to everyone as Tony, who received the same sentence as his mother. During the sentencing hearing, Tony, who declined to speak when given the opportunity, heard the victim impact statement made by his aunt, Christina Blumel, who thanked the authorities for administering justice and referred to all the love that Roger and Melissa had given the boy. In complete silence, Tony listened to Christina's heartfelt words, and at one moment, tears almost sprang from the young criminal's eyes. In the end, the woman told Tony that he had chosen his path without anyone forcing him to make those decisions. She added that perhaps one day he might understand his choices, or perhaps he never would. Tony has been since then in a correctional facility. His record up to this moment listed a significant number of prison infractions related to smuggling, fights, unauthorized phone use, explicit sex, theft, and disobedience, among others. A week after these sentences, it was Andrew's turn, the only one who did not agree to acknowledge his responsibility and was found guilty of first and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, plus 155 months. Finally, Braden, the last of the participants in the incident and who from the beginning had reached an agreement with the prosecution, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 24.5 years in prison. According to his official record, his first opportunity for release will be on May 28, 2035. However, his prison record shows that far from reforming, Braden had received 71 disciplinary reports for disobedience, threats to others, stimulant use, intoxication, possession of tobacco contraband, theft, and dangerous smuggling, among other causes. In the end, the district attorney expressed satisfaction with the outcome of this case. It's worth noting that even though she had waived that right, Keisha attempted to appeal her sentences unsuccessfully. At the end of this story, only one thing remains undisputed: the lives of two wonderful people, Roger and Melissa Blumel, were cut short with a terrible and unnecessary ending. The bitterness, or perhaps the guilt of a woman who led a life of excess for which she gave up her children for adoption, was the genesis of the tragedy. She couldn't bear that one of her descendants wanted nothing more to do with her, which apparently led her to direct her anger at the people who gave all their love and well-being to her children. For his part, Tony repaid all the love and care received from that couple with resentment, envy, and violence, resorting to an unjustifiable path of substance abuse, and finally, a double crime. Keisha's younger daughter ended up being sent to a foster home. As for Chris Blumel, he managed to overcome what happened and has led a good life with the support of the family. And well, dear audience, that concludes today's case. Before you go, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to share this video if you think someone you know might be interested. See you in another episode of Unreal True Crime. Goodbye.